We are finally at what I think might be the coolest part of the Ferrari build so far. We have driven it, we have raced it, we have blown it up. Now it's time to make it better. Our new engine is ready to go in. We've just got to attach the clutch, the flywheel, and the transmission. But before it's in our way, we got to get in here and clean the bay up because the last engine blew up and made a huge mess for us. That ain't gonna work. I also want to talk about the fuel system. I'd like to make this thing E85 compatible. I want to add to our electronics package and give us a way to control everything from here at the back of the car. We'll talk about that more. And we've also got to build a turbo adapter to put our smaller turbo on that's going to make more power. Kind of confusing. Let's talk about it. Let's make the car better than ever before. Now here's hoping if you're watching this episode, you're already up to speed and you remember when we pulled the K24 out of the Ferrari and you remember the absolute carnage that ensued. We've got several fist-sized holes in the block of our K24 because we sent a rod out seemingly at the speed of sound. And in the same weekend, we also sent the car off track, filling the engine bay with dirt in every nook and cranny. And unfortunately, that's left us with a huge mess to clean up. And I think it's imperative that we get the engine bay of the Ferrari looking as good as it did when we first finished it before we go and stick another engine in its place. Now, to be fair, this might sound like a vanity project, that I want the car nice and shiny, ready for a show before we put the engine back in, but the reality is we need it to be clean so we can identify future problems and leaks as we get this car back out on the circuit. But to clean up a mess of this caliber, we're going to have to bring in some heavy firepower, and so I want to make sure we are protecting every possible component. There are a number of open AN lines on this car that I want to get plugged up so that we don't get any foreign debris in any of these systems, such as our fuel lines or oil lines. Now, it's been a while since I've done a relatively cheap tool shoutout, so here's one for you guys with AN lines like these that need plugs or caps, whatever the reason may be. I bought a really cheap plug and cap set from Amazon, and I'm going to put a link down in the description if you want one for yourself, but for $50, it came with everything from Dash 3 all the way up to Dash 16, both plugs and caps, and it made this job super easy. I can't count how many times I've been looking for parts like these within my bins of parts and pieces, only to come up short and have to tape up lines, but now I'm equipped to cap anything that I need to, whether it's for something like this or just because I pulled the engine out of the car and don't want to make a mess. Now, if capping all of our lines sounds like overkill for a cleanup job, that's fair, but we're not going to be using cleaners and towels for this one. Instead, we're going to push the car outside and then down the street 2 driveways over to our friend Joel's shop. Joel has been an awesome neighbor that's offered up his services on more than one occasion, and this time he called me up and said, "Mike, I've got a few 100 pounds of dry ice that needs using, and I've got the equipment if you're interested." Joel runs below zero dry ice cleaning, and although we've done a bit of dry ice blasting on this channel in the past, Joel's equipment is a completely different caliber. We're talking about industrial-grade equipment and an air compressor that is both as big and as expensive as a car. Now, for the curious, yes, a cleanup job as excessive as this normally has some serious costs associated with it, but Joel was kind enough to give us the neighborly hookup, and he taught me how to run his equipment so that I could dive in and start tackling some of it myself. He said, "Despite what you see on YouTube and all these beautiful compilations of cleanup work, it is a slow and often arduous process that is a battle of attrition against the dirt and grime. There's a lot of calibration with the machine involved in order to decide how much ice we want to flow and what size we want those ice particles to be. Because if turned up, this machine's capable of blasting rust and paint right off of the metal. But in this case, we want it to gently remove all of the grease and oil while protecting what's underneath." As you might guess, Joel dove in first and gave me the rundown. He showed me the process and got me familiar with how this whole thing is going to work. Now, it's important to remember that our dry sump system holds 17 quarts of oil, and we lost all of it when our engine blew up, and it coated every surface under the hood of this thing. Combined with the silty dust of Buttonwillow, California, it creates a cake that covers everything and is all but impossible to remove. But thankfully, Below Zero's equipment made quick work of the grease, the grime, and the dust, and got us looking as good as the day we painted it. I spent several hours cleaning up the Ferrari, and then Joel came in the next morning and finished up the hard work. His meticulous care to get every surface clean really shows in the end result, and I think you guys will be just as impressed as I was to see the finished product. But by cleaning everything just 1 square inch at a time, you're quickly reminded just how much surface area there really is under the hood of something like this. But enough rambling about the cleanup or the process. We can call this job done, and I'm excited to show you what the end result actually looks like, because this thing hasn't looked this good since we put it together. Now, to be fair, there is a little bit of staining on the raw aluminum from having fuel atop it, and there's plenty of chipped paint that has revealed itself from all of the times that we've pulled the engine in and out of this thing, but those are easy to fix, because the rest of this thing looks clean enough to eat off of. And again, the importance here is now we can identify any potential problems or leaks once we have the new engine in, as long as I can manage to keep this thing on the track and not full of dirt. You guys probably know as well as I do, there's probably only a 50% chance of that happening, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Now, on the note of chipped paint, this is exactly why we used aerosol Steal-It to paint the bay to begin with. I wanted to make sure that in this event, or if I ever needed to do touch-up welding or anything else, we'd be able to just touch up the paint with a perfect match every time. No prep, no headache. I wanted an easy job to keep this engine bay looking nice and tidy. And here we have it, working to a T. Is this show car stuff? No. But this isn't a show car. It's a race car, and it's a race car I want to keep in tip-top shape. And this is the perfect way to do it. Now for this next upgrade, some of you guys are going to get a little bit lost. We're diving into some details, a little technical. It's a little weird, and it's totally unnecessary, but I'm excited about it. What I've got here is an 8-button Haltech CAN control pad, and this is really similar to what's inside the car that we use to control all of the systems in the car, whether it's turning it on or cycling anything electronic. Now, why do I have another one? Well, I want to add it to the back of the car here on the outside so I can cycle any function that I want to program to these buttons. And that's what's cool about this Haltech system. It all operates on a CAN bus, which means any of these upgrades we've added, we can plug them in wherever we want and they will work. Same thing with control modules. We can plug this into any CAN port and immediately get access to control anything we want to. And in this case, I want to be able to start and stop the car from back here. Let's say maybe we're on the dyno and I don't want to be climbing in and out. We just need to cycle some stuff. Or maybe I want to turn on the fuel pump and drain the fuel cell. Maybe I want to turn on the water pumps and start cycling coolant, or I'm trying to bleed it. All stuff that could be really handy while I'm back here working on the car instead of trying to climb in and out of it. Is this necessary? Not at all. Is it cool? Absolutely. And I want to make this removable. It doesn't need to live back here full time. So we're going to 3D print some parts. We're going to make this a temporary system. Anytime we need it, I can just come in, I can plug it in, set it down, and if we want to control it from the back of the car, we can, and then when we're ready to go out on track, we unplug it, pull it off, and head out. So let's add this to our system. But believe it or not, this project doesn't start with the CAN pad. It starts with this bulkhead connector, because we need a place to plug the CAN pad in. I want to start on one end of the system and work our way forwards, so I hopped into Fusion and designed this 3D printable mount so that we can bolt that bulkhead to the car in an unintrusive way. I'm printing it with PETG carbon fiber filament so that it's strong and heat resistant within the engine bay. And of course, thanks to you guys in the comments, I've also learned that it's wall layer count, not infill, that makes for strong parts. 7 wall loops on this thing has it nice and sturdy, and of course, the finished product after removing our support material looks fantastic. It fits the bulkhead connector perfectly, and I've decided in order to attach these two parts together, I'm going to try rivets. I haven't really seen rivets used on 3D printed material, but I figured why not give it a shot and see how it works. And I'm happy to say my initial impression is that this is pretty sweet and it does feel sturdy. So we're going to try it in execution. Some of you will hate my mounting location, but I'm mounting it through the sheet metal of the body, right next to our intercooler filler neck. It's a nice little empty place that's out of the way and keeps the part secluded, but is easily accessible from the side of the car. From there, all we've got to do is run our wire to the bulkhead connector, so it's done. All right, so now we have a bulkhead connector mounted right here. This is a hard point. We can plug any CAN product into this that we want, whether it's this button or if we want to plug in anything else, we can plug it in right here and it will interface with the rest of our computer. The wiring from this, which I have to finalize, goes to this CAN bus cable, and it simply plugs in when we put our engine back in the car, along with the rest of this stuff. We'll plug it into a pre-existing port, and that's done. So now let's mount the CAN pad and make it removable so that we can plug it in when we need it and remove it when we don't.
And I'm sure it's obvious, but this is the CAN pad itself. A quick nod to Haltech, they include all of the dimensions for mounting this thing in their factory paperwork, which made designing this 3D printable mount a breeze. There was no guesswork, no measuring involved. I just drew it up and then added a groove on the back that will hold onto the rubber bulb seal at the back of the car in order to mount it. That seemed like a good option to make it removable.
All right, so we've got our finished 3D printed part, and it turned out reasonably well. I think it looks really good, aside from some of the surfaces where the holes on the inside are, but that doesn't really matter. They get covered up anyways. And so once we actually fit our part to it, I actually think that looks pretty good. It looks like a professionally manufactured part. 3D printing has changed everything in this shop. This machine has been incredible. Can't believe it. So now I want to get this thing bolted up, and then we're going to test fit it on the car, make sure that it kind of fits the way that I hope it does. I took a little bit of a gamble and just made some assumptions, so we're going to find out.
The last part of this job, of course, was to make a jumper harness to go from the CAN pad to that bulkhead connector we installed earlier. This is a very simple 4-wire cable that uses a Deutsch connector on each end, thanks to the fact that Haltech uses Deutsch for their hardware.
So we've got our finished CAN pad mount and buttons, and I just wrapped up this little jumper cable that will allow it to plug in. These two are going to live together. There's no reason to unplug them from each other. And so here is our finished button unit. This will connect and disconnect from the car when we want to use it. Hopefully it fits. Nice and snug on the rubber seal there. That's what I was hoping for. And then, yeah, the plug just kind of comes over here and plugs into that bulkhead connector. That would be it. If we had a harness in the car, this would officially operate. It would turn everything on and off. And what's cool is we can program these buttons to do literally anything we want, any function in the computer, not just what we have labels for. I just kind of picked the obvious ones that I know I'm going to want, like starting and stopping the car, running the fuel pump, water pump, any of that kind of stuff, data logging, etc. So I'm pretty stoked. It's really nice and sturdy. It hangs on there pretty good. And then when we want to go out on track, we just pick up on it, pull it up, unplug it, and we're off. And I already know some of you guys are going to say, well, now you have an open plug here. It's right behind the tire. You're going to get water, mud, tire grease, rubber, etc. in it. And I'm one step ahead because I made a delete dummy plug that can just go in here, seals it up, ready to go.
It's hard to argue that this needed to get done before the car runs because it didn't, but I think it will be a huge quality of life improvement, and I'm really happy with the outcome. I think a lot of you will fully understand just how helpful this is going to be as I'm working on the car, especially once it's running again. But as one project comes to an end, another begins. Our friend Matt from Position Advance stopped by the shop in need of a helping hand to solve a relatively simple problem, and apparently we're the ones for the job.
Our friends over at Position Advance need some sway bar end links shortened by 2 inches for a track day tomorrow, I think. And so we figured, why not just help them out, knock these out. They're quick and dirty. They're not going to be beautiful, but it'll at least get them on the track.
Matt, Dom, and the rest of the Position Advance team have been some of the most awesome guys at the track every time I go, and they've supported all of my efforts to get out there and become a better driver, and this is just one tiny way to pay back their support and guidance that they've given me, as well as the welcoming hand they've given me into the track community that they've helped to build. As for shortening these sway bar end links, I'm going with the quick and dirty method. I chopped 2 inches right out of the middle, beveled the ends, and simply TIG welded them back together. It was kind of tricky to make sure they stayed straight, but again, it didn't have to be perfect. These aren't a permanent solution. The trickiest part of the job was simply keeping the ball joints on each end from overheating through the welding process. It was important to make frequent stops during welding in order to cool down the part with both compressed air and by dipping the end links in water at each end. But of course, we don't want to quench the weld itself because it could get brittle, and that could spell disaster. With the end links done, it's back to the Ferrari, and now we need to talk about the turbo setup on the 244. Right now, we're running a Garrett G42 1200 Compact, which is an enormous turbo. It's truthfully only meant for drag racing or making power on the dyno, but as you can see, on track, this thing has some serious lag and doesn't kick in until 6,000 RPM. In truth, we could put a much smaller turbo on this thing, make more peak power, and have significantly more power throughout the rev range, and that's going to make this car way faster once that G30 arrives.
But the project I want to tackle at the moment is building an adapter for our new turbo in anticipation of its arrival. Now, I know that building an adapter for this isn't as good as modifying the manifold and making this a one-and-done solution, but we might want to change that turbo in the future because this is a project that will take a lot of revisions. We might want to change the size or what have you. So I'm not going to go with permanent yet. Now, this is the G42 that we had in the car before, and this is the flange, technically exactly what is attached to our manifold. This goes here. It's a V-band, they interlock and seals everything up. Now, what I can't go easily buy is the flange that's cast into the stainless housing of the turbo, but if I take this one and modify it, I can make it match this side so that it can be received over here, and we can use our V-band clamp to attach it. Now, what are we gonna do with that? Well, then we have this flange, which is essentially the same flange that would go here on the smaller turbo that we don't have yet. So what I want to do is build a piece that goes between these two, as short as possible, that kind of stacks on here like this and allows us to bolt a smaller turbo onto this manifold. Is this manifold perfect? No. Most of you guys remember this is my first ever TIG welding project, but it works really well. It's got awesome boost control, doesn't have any boost creep, it's got wastegate priority, it's worked really well, hasn't cracked. I'm really happy with it, so why not keep using it for the time being until someday when we build a thin 321 stainless manifold that's way lighter. So how are we going to join these? Well, we went down the road and I bought a handful of stainless cones. It'll mate up kind of here if we kind of modify it a bit and then do this number. Boom, transition, it'll work really well. It's kind of long though. So we got these shorter ones that if we cut them up, transition more quickly. I can kind of get that positioned, and this one would be about that long. So I think that's what we're going to go with. We'll have to do some cutting, some modifying. We'll get it all welded up, and what we will have is, unfortunately, one extra V-band that we don't need, but again, it gives us the ability to change this turbo out, change the adapter, move things around. It's not a permanent solution, and we don't need a permanent solution so long as this thing works. So let's try it out.
And so we find ourselves over at Nimmo Machine once again to pay our friend Brett a visit so that he can machine this flange to mate with our turbo manifold. Again, the goal is to transform this from a male flange to a female flange because the female side of this isn't available. It's only cast in the turbo housing itself. Brett, on the other hand, has both the skills and the equipment to machine this down into the part that we need, and at the same time, he's willing to cut down our cone so that it's both concentric and the correct diameter at each end.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
That should work. This is the high temp stuff.
Of course, it just fits together like it was machined that way. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Brett. Whoop.
Oh, no.
I broke it, I snapped it. Perfect.
I don't warp it at all. Welding.
No promises. Yeah, I think this will work great. All right, we're out of here.
All right, cool.
Thank you so much for
welcome.
fitting this in. I appreciate it, as always.
No problem.
Cool. All right, let's go put a Ferrari back together.
All right.
Just like that, we've got a more or less finished part. I just got to weld it together. And as always, Brett absolutely killed it. Everything he touches is absolute gold. This thing fits together like it was meant to, which I know makes sense. So now what we've got is a proper mating surface between these two. We'll get all this welded up, and now our new turbo can mount to our existing manifold, and it'll have nice flow characteristics. It's really not going to provide any restriction. It's going to have great flow. Won't have any kind of weird things going on. So overall, I'm excited. This is exactly what we needed. There's only a slight gamble about whether or not the turbo is going to clear the sump tank because the old one was pretty close, but I think given that the new one is smaller, I think we will have enough room for this adapter, and if not, we'll cross that path when we get there.
The only question that I have is whether or not the 18 gauge cone will be up to the task, but given that it is high quality stainless and given that we're going to support the turbo itself, there shouldn't be too much load on this and I think it will be just fine. But if we have to redesign this later, so be it.
Now obviously the next step is to weld this together, and we're going to get there, but we need to back purge it, and before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about back purging. We've mentioned it in the past. I've shown you my line and I've wrapped things in foil, but I've never shown you what we're trying to avoid, which is sugaring on the inside of a weld. So I'm going to weld these test pieces up and show you what a non-back purged stainless weld actually looks like, so you can see what we're trying to avoid, and then we'll weld this up and I'll show you the finished product and we'll compare and contrast.
Now for a quick explanation of what back purging is. Oxygen contaminates welds. It's as simple as that. The front side of the weld is protected by the white gas lens on my TIG torch, but the inside of the tube has no form of protection at all. It is exposed to pure oxygen, and thus, while the front side of the weld comes out nice, clean, and with pretty colors, the inside of the weld does not. If we cut this tube open and look inside, you'll see this nasty black crust. Think of it almost like a form of rust. It's oxidation on the backside of the weld. Not only does this make the weld significantly weaker, this oxidation can break loose and wreak havoc on other systems. So how do we prevent this? Well, that is what back purging is. We have to fill the inside of the tube, or in this case, whatever part we're welding, with the same argon gas we're spraying on the outside using the TIG torch. I'm using the exhaust housing in this turbo in order to keep my part from warping as I weld it, but as you can see, I'm plumbing argon gas into the inside of this housing so that there is no oxygen inside. By positively displacing the oxygen inside of this housing with argon, we eliminate the opportunity for the welds to become contaminated on the inside. But back purging can be tricky at times. It often requires some creativity when you want to figure out how to fill a specific part with argon without it escaping. Welding the first flange was easy enough given that I could attach it to the turbo housing, but the second side, less so. I clamped the entire part down to the workbench to keep it from warping, and then I plumbed argon up into the part through one of the holes in my table so that we could still effectively back purge it. Now, to be clear, you can weld stainless without back purging it, but this is definitely the correct way to do it if you want good results. One glimpse inside of the part and you'll see there is an entire world of difference in the end result, because here, there is no sugaring to be found, and that is what we want.
So here is our finished turbo adapter. I'll show you how it's going to work in a moment, but what's important right this second, past ignoring my imperfect welds, is looking at how the finished surface is on the inside. Now if we compare this to the piece I showed you guys earlier, that sugary surface on the inside, this is terrible. This is what it's supposed to look like, or within reason. There's no contamination, there's no oxidation, there's nothing that's going to come off and go into our turbo. This is why we back purge. And yeah, it costs a bit of extra money to do. You're spending more money on gas. Sometimes it's a headache, it's a pain to figure out how to do a setup, make it all work, but this is the outcome. This is why we do it. If you're going to weld stainless, take the time to back purge it and do it the right way. You'll have a better part.
And so we have a finished adapter for a turbo that we don't have, and we don't know if it will necessarily work, but I'm still happy with the outcome. As you guys can see, it's got a nice, simple taper to it, and I think it's going to spool up our G30 very effectively. The only remaining step to call this part truly finished is to send it out for Cerakoting like the rest of our exhaust parts, because stainless, whether we want it or not, is going to turn brown with enough heat.
Now there is one other variable with this adapter that I've got to take into consideration, and we're not even going to know an answer until all of this stuff is put together. There's clearly a stack height to this adapter, and when it's on the manifold, it's going to push the turbo down, lower in the car. And with our current turbo, there's not room to do that. It's only maybe this far away from our sump tank. But the new turbo, the G30, is going to be significantly smaller than the G42, and I think we will have this much room to play with, so I'm not too worried about it. But what I didn't consider is the fact that because we're going to a K20 instead of a K24, the block overall deck height is shorter on the K20. We lost about 19 millimeters of overall height, which means the turbo, the manifold, and the cylinder head all move down inside the car 3/4 of an inch. And that might mean with this adapter, the turbo isn't gonna fit in the car. And if that happens, I'm not exactly sure what we're going to do yet. I think the only real option is to redesign our turbo manifold. Now, I wouldn't be that upset about it. I am happy with how this one works, but it is TIG project number 1. First thing I ever TIG welded. There's a lot of room for improvement on this, and instead of using this thick scheduled pipe, we could go to 321 thin wall stainless and lose a lot of weight in the back of the car. So that'll be the silver lining, but ideally this adapter is going to work, and with the new deck height of the K20, everything will clear by just a little bit. But we're not going to know until it's all in place.
And while we're waiting on other parts to show up, there are a few small odds and ends we can still knock out, such as the fact that the window keeps breaking its lower rivet and coming loose. I can't say that this is surprising given how much force is exerted on such a large windshield made of plastic, but instead of continuing to drill out the rivet and replace it, this time we're going to put a bolt in because I know that it won't come out. Some of you may even remember that this is the exact same fix we did to the top of this support while we were in Australia. The rest of the riveted clamps around the edge of the windshield, though, seem to be working perfectly, and I'm still very happy with the design. Are steps like this worth documenting? I don't know. You tell me. It feels pretty silly, but it's another job we needed to do crossed off the list.
Now, when I first got a K-Series, I was told by a handful of friends of mine that it was going to vibrate literally everything on this car loose, and I didn't really believe them, especially after we put solid engine mounts in this thing. Every single nut and bolt on this car tries to come loose, including stuff unrelated to the engine. While we were dry ice blasting, I realized that our entire quarter panel is loose, and it shouldn't move like that. So we've got a support in here that we made right before we finished the car for SEMA. We're gonna need some new hardware put into that, some lock hardware, lock washers and stuff, and then knock out some other things that have come loose at the same time.
And when I say everything has come loose on this car, I mean it. Some of you may even remember the axle nuts worked themselves loose despite being torqued to an immense rating, and then a second time after we red Loctited them on and updated the torque rating to the latest Corvette spec. This car will absolutely serve as a huge lesson in torquing everything down and checking everything between sessions on track. And now for my final talking point of the episode. I know some of you are wondering why we don't go on and drop the engine into place, and that's because the engine blocks our access to the fuel system. We'll get nerdy on the specs in the next episode, but the simple explanation is that right now this car has a Weldon 1100A fuel pump in it, which is an incredible unit, but it's not E85 compatible. Given that I'd like to run this car on ethanol in the future, I think while the engine is out of the way, the smartest thing to do is change out this fuel pump so that the entire system is E85 friendly, because the pump is the only thing that's not. And while everything is apart, I want to add a surge tank while we're at it.
All in all, I think that represents some pretty good progress on the Ferrari this week. The big thing is, as always, we're waiting on parts. Once our fuel system shows up, we're going to install it, and that means the engine can go in. We just kind of need that access to that fuel cell before the engine's in place. Once the engine's in place, we can mount our new turbo, we can make sure our adapter works, we can figure out if we've got to modify anything. We might even find ourselves having to make a new turbo manifold. Fingers crossed we don't have to do that. We've got to design a new engine mount. Everything else should just go together. It should work. We are one major step closer to firing this thing up for the first time, getting it over to Animal Auto on the dyno. Let's get it tuned and out on track, which I am so eager for. I've been waiting since November. I'm hopeful within the next month we're going to be out on track, tearing it up, going faster than ever before. Of course, in the California summer heat. It's going to be miserable. It's going to be fun. It's type 2 fun. I'll catch you guys there. Don't forget, if you want to support the channel, you can buy some of our merch. We've still got some t-shirts left in stock, or head over to the Patreon, try to make it worth everybody's while. We're working on that piston giveaway, and you're going to want one because they're pretty sweet. Anyways, thank you guys for the support. I'll catch you next week.